Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to speak on behalf of Pfizer. Looking at the agenda, it really is a great and diverse agenda, obviously with a common cause of trying to find new and safe, effective treatments for the rare disease community. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about was the imperative to innovate. At Pfizer, it's kind of our number one core imperative. Our number one core imperative is innovation. And I'm going to start out a little bit unorthodox with a list of companies from 1912. And you look at the list of companies, and they're largely commodity-based companies. They were the leaders of industry in 1912. They were representative of their fields. They typically were also, when you comprise the industrial average, for those of you who don't know, it's really a barometer or a measure of the country's economic status. How are we doing as a country? And what strikes me when I look at a list, and you can go back and look at a list from 100 years ago or 50 years ago, most of these companies, with the exception of one, no longer exist as an individual company. The only company that still exists is General Electric. The rest, a few have been subsumed by larger companies, but most have no longer are in business. And the reason is why, probably failure to innovate. Was it that they thought too narrowly of their business model, of their value proposition, or was it a disruptive force that really changed the model? And I'll just read kind of a definition, not my definition, but kind of accepted definition of disruptive force. It really is an innovation that helps create a new market and apply a different set of values with which ultimately then overtakes an existing market. So an example, obviously, of that era was the transportation. If you think about in the early 1900s, people lived in cities. They mainly walked. If they wanted to travel, they went on trains. The automotive industry, and especially the mass-produced automotive industry, changed that. That was a disruptive trend to transportation. It changed the way people live, it changed infrastructure in the country, and it was clearly an innovation. Well, these are, 100 years ago, there's also very recent examples of failure to innovate and disruptive forces. Think of many companies we probably all know, like Kodak, who once dominated the photography. And their value proposition was really the actual film, the developing, and what digital photography did to that market, or Blockbuster and movies, and what Netflix and digital did there. So these are examples, obviously, of when you think about how you think about a problem or a solution for a individual industry and the value that one could bring to that industry. These are examples of changing and shifting a paradigm and a process and a way to think about providing value. The pharma's business model is really based on innovation. From the moment we sign a patent, the clock starts. And we have a defined life to really to get value back from products we develop. Many products don't make it. We look back in our pipeline and we think that we need many products in phase 3, even more in phase 2, even more in phase 1, and many, many more in preclinical development. We call this model kind of R&D. It's the lifeblood of our industry. And it's our reason for being is to create new and innovative products. At Pfizer, we kind of say we apply, our mission is really to apply innovative science to improve world health. So while it's important for this list of companies, for Pfizer to innovate, the stakes are much higher for the rare disease community. If you think about the over 250 million people worldwide who suffer from a rare disease, these are mothers and fathers, siblings, and often, and well too often, children who suffer from these fatal diseases without an approved treatment. So the imperative to innovate and disrupt the trend that we're currently on is even greater here. We all know the numbers. I think they've been referred to this morning. Around 7,000 rare diseases have been identified to date, with about 5% with an available treatment. If I just look at this trend here, the Orphan Drug Act really provided in the US, and there's similar acts in Europe and Mexico, Japan, but not in all countries. But the Orphan Drug Act in 1983 really put drugs in a regulatory framework. They provided incentives for development, and and clearer definitions. You can see prior to the 1983 Act, in the 10 years prior, there was less than 10 drugs approved for orphan designated products. Since the Act, there's been about over 350 products approved and 200,000, a little over 2,400 with orphan designation. So clearly you can see a disruption. But if you continue that trend, you see that we need to do more. It would be well over 500 years at the current rate of about 10 or so drugs approved per year for an orphan drug in the United States until we satisfied the 7,000 rare diseases. Now, that's if the 7,000 number stayed at that number, and we all know that number continues to grow as well. So we must disrupt this trend. We must create a disruptive force, like the examples earlier in industry, to bring more products to market so we can increase this number from about 10 per year to 10x per year. And as a community, we all have a role, all on the behalf of patients, to bring this disruptive force to bear. Clearly, it's going to start with science. Science and the emerging science will certainly advance the ability to disrupt. And I'll just go through a few examples of why we feel the time is now really to change this disruption. One is biomarkers. So, biomarkers clearly can be an indicator of a disease or a condition, can be used to show how treatment is effective of a disease. And I think we're all familiar with many biomarkers that are well known and the impact of disease, things like cholesterol or blood pressure and heart disease, or proteinuria and kidney disease. But more development of biomarkers in rare disease would certainly be very helpful, not only in understanding the disease, but really establishing a quicker path for development of drugs. Surrogate endpoints and trials that use biomarkers clearly can be powered differently. It can usually progress a lot faster and maybe even take advantage of things like Subpart H, at least in the regulatory context from an FDA. Natural history studies. So really understanding and creating natural histories to really understand disease progression and prognosis. These natural history studies, if well understood and well studied, could really support drug development. Maybe even support the use of biomarkers. And if well established, historic control for a study. So use the prognosis and the data that's in the study as a control, historical control for active patient. Really, the key advancement from a science point of view beyond biomarkers and natural history has been genetic data. So we've understand now the disease, the genetic basis of over 4,000 diseases, monogenetic diseases. Now, we all know that there's a challenge sometimes of, as we're seeing, of mapping that understanding of the disease to a targeted therapy. There's some examples where that has occurred, but there is more advancement in terms of at least creating that understanding of that genetic basis creates the target and understanding for where drugs need to work. If you consider the mapping of the genome took about 13 years and about over $3 billion. You can see this trend, quite a change. If you look back a little over 10 years ago, it was about $100 million in many months to map a genome. Now I think we see from the National Human Genome Research that it's around $3,000. And I've read, and I'm sure we've all read recently, that this is approaching under $1,000 a day and can be done in under a day. So clearly the ability for gene sequencing and to make this part of a normal diagnostic when patients go into a doctor's office and instead of drawing a normal blood panel, understanding the genetic basis of a disease, the time should not be far away. When you think about the understanding of genetics, it really helps us change the taxonomy of disease and the way we think about disease. I'll use Duchenne's muscular dystrophy as an example and the impact of dystrophin loss. It's really not a one disease, it's a single genetic disease, but a disease of numerous genetic mutations. So namely, the mutations are typically, if you look over here, they're either point mutations, deletions, or duplications. Around 83% of them can be, could have drugs developed for using exon skipping therapy or read-through therapy. If you look at the top 10 exon skipping, you can see that drug development in many of these areas are actually being developed, could create shortened but functional dystrophin for over half of the individuals who suffer from DMD. So you look at this and we think about changing the way genetics, really changing our understanding of disease, changing the way we define disease, that Duchenne's is not one disease, but really many different genetic bases of disease, and therefore different targets from a drug development point of view. That really brings us to the era of you bring these things together of precision medicine. I think a good recent example of this is Kalydeco by Vertex. If you think about the 4% of people with cystic fibrosis who have a gating defect in their ion channel, this therapy targets exactly that subset of patients who are diagnosed with a specific genetic test and therefore could benefit from treatment. If you don't have that gating defect, you're not going to benefit from that treatment. So it's clearly the understanding of genetics it has a profound impact on medicine. And we think about precision medicine. Sorry, I went too far. Let me go back one. Precision medicine really brings these things together. It really says, do I understand the genetic basis of the disease? Do I understand the valid and the rare phenotypes or the molecular basis of the disease? And creation of understanding who are the patients who suffer from that, and therefore create a target, and for that patient subpopulation, that target or combination really can serve as the drug delivery for that specific population. A recent example also from Pfizer is we used to think about lung cancer as a single disease, and about half of, I think many of us know, about half of the 7,000 rare diseases are actually oncology conditions. And we used to think about carcinoma and histology of a cell and look at, and there was a diagnosis of lung cancer. But there's a more broader understanding of lung cancer, like the DMD example, where we're actually classifying it based on genetic mutations. Pfizer recently got a medicine approved, crizotinib or Xalkori, that targets 3 to 5%, this yellow slice here in the pie, 3 to 5% of oncology patients who have lung cancer. So with the right genetic test, bringing that test together and understanding the genetics and a targeted therapy can certainly have an impact. If you think about Kalydeco, when you have a precision approach like that, it took 3 months from registration to approval. Xalkori took 4 months, and it was actually 4 years from discovery to approval of the drug. So when you can create that kind of targeted approach, not only does it help the regulatory process, but also it's well suited for the current reimbursement environment. I think we heard a little bit earlier today around the need to innovate, the need to have products that are differentiated, that are not me too, the need for products to have a profound impact on patients and payers. And these recent examples certainly are that. But beyond the science, there really is the environment that we need to create for rare disease. And it's many things. It's the education and the awareness. It's flexibility from regulators. It's the policy environment. It's patients. It's advocacy. So if you think about each one of these, the education and awareness. I know in the PDUFA 5 that is going through legislation right now, there's language in here for mandatory education for FDA to create more awareness within the review division. The FDA also is, for the rare disease community, about a year or two ago has started workshops for companies to help understand the process and the actual application process for rare disease, as well as starting of natural history studies. There's also signs of increased flexibility. This study here by Frank Sazanowski, sponsored by NORD, really showed and looked at an evidence towards a regulatory flexible environment. If you look for each decade, about 65 to 70% of the orphan drugs that were approved weren't approved through the normal 2 well-controlled phase 3 trials. There was administrative flexibility, case-by-case flexibility, so there's certainly a shift and a look towards flexibility by regulators. If you think about policies, there's many areas of policy. One of the things that Angus talked about earlier was payers, and I think Pfizer has had a similar transformation of understanding and the payer value proposition, and for them to understand why a drug is better than one that's on the market, especially if it's not an innovative drug. But when we all know what it takes to create a drug for rare disease. And there's many markets in the world, by the time you get through the discovery process and the development process and the regulatory process, and you finally get a product approved, there's many markets in the world that it takes 1.5 years and over 2 years for patients to get reimbursement and access to that drug. So we certainly need policies to change that. HTAs, when they look at reimbursement for drugs, oftentimes they're really thought about for more common disease, and there's a value pricing that goes into those drugs. Rare diseases often don't fit that value pricing model, and HTAs need to take this into account. It really is about the disease burden, the unmet need, the access to care, the effect of the treatment. And without reimbursement, the impact on an individual patient and their ability to pay. Other kinds of policy advancements certainly could be, we talked about the Orphan Drug Act in the US, but there's many countries, including Canada, China, that don't have a orphan designation, that don't have a process for orphan drugs to go through. So certainly we need some more harmonization on at least the thought process for a regulatory and an incentives for orphan drug development. The other thing, and I know we've talked to Nord about this, and really looking at a policy to enable patients to be part of the decision process when risk-based decisions are made by regulatory agencies. So if you go to the Nord website, I know there's some pretty interesting thoughts in terms of how we can introduce patients by not overwhelming regulators into the process, so patients are part and participating in part of that whenever, when an IND gets delivered, and when a trial is going to start, or when a phase 3 decision is going to get made at the end of phase 3 relative to approval, having patients participate. This year, as part of the patient reach out, it was great to see the FDA in terms of reaching out to patients and having their first ever rare disease patient advocacy day the day after the overall rare disease day. And it really helped facilitate a dialogue between regulators and patients and the understanding of the regulatory process. So clearly we see an environment where the patient participation is certainly part of, and it needs to continue to be more part of the process. Advocacy, I think we heard earlier this morning, there's nothing more powerful than patient and advocacy. As a parent myself, I know there's nothing more powerful than the health and the well-being of your children. And patient advocacy is really where that starts. And if we could, a few things here, if we could bring together patient advocacy. In a recent internal Congress we had, it was interesting to hear an individual from the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy group and how there's over 43 advocacy groups for Duchenne's. Imagine if there was a handful or one. The power of that unified voice on discovery of drugs, on determining and helping with enrollment for quicker trials, in the regulatory process, in the reimbursement process, in the natural history, in the funding. So bringing patient advocacy groups together. Clearly, patient advocacy does many things. You think about cystic fibrosis. In the late 90s, the decision for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation to fund around $75 million to Aurora Biosciences, who was later acquired by Vertex. This ultimately led to a understanding of a rare mutation, this G5551D mutation, which is a gating defect that I talked about earlier, and ultimately resulted in the approval of Cladico. So another example, and it's also a group that I know Pfizer is working with as a Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, is certainly trying to create medicines and therapies for their patient population. So none of us can do this alone. When you consider, and you can kind of look at these headlines, this really does take an effort across all of us. It's part of the community. I think these scientific trends, the regulatory changes, the advocacy and the consistent will that advocates have, it really changed the risk equation for pharma. It was mentioned that Pfizer's recently entered the rare disease space. We've actually been in the rare disease space for very many years. We have 17 products with orphan designation. We never thought of ourselves as a rare disease company up until probably about 2 years ago, and we looked at the opportunities and said, patients are our #1 focus. There's an opportunity for us to play as part of the overall rare disease community. We have a research and development organization. We have 12 different research organizations, all pretty large. We spend over $7 billion in research. And my job is really to, given that risk equation and that changing risk equation, both scientifically and regulatory, is to shift more and more of that research funding to rare disease. If I think of 2 short years ago, we didn't have much of a pipeline focused on rare disease. Today we have a product in phase 2, we have 2 in registration, and we have 10 products in preclinical development and 2 that just hit IND. So we're not by no means declaring anywhere near victory, but it's certainly progress, and we're the largest pharma, but a small player in a big problem, and certainly want to be part of the community to help create more products for rare disease. I bring up a couple of these headlines here around, you can see around the collaborations with organizations, with Pfizer, with Roche, with Shire, but it really gets to the point of that this really is a collaborative effort across industry. So I can only speak, and I think it was talked earlier around Shire and Brave. At Pfizer, we've kind of have these 3 words: innovation, compassion, and commitment. Compassion and the patient is certainly at the heart of that. I've talked about innovation, and I can only describe for you maybe how Pfizer thinks of themselves as part of the community by some very specific examples. One is when we think about working with academia. We've partnered with many academic organizations like the Children's Hospital of Boston for muscular dystrophy and other rare diseases. We also have a research group called the Center of CTI, what we call the Center for Therapeutic Innovation. That research unit's sole purpose is to create collaborations with academia and small biotechs throughout globally, and we have many of these research collaborations and some in rare disease. If you think about advocacy, clearly we're very supportive of organizations like NORD and Uritis, as well as individual rare disease organizations like acromegaly and hemophilia. We certainly collaborate with nonprofits, which I talked a little bit about, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and are working together really to help to create a drug for the other 96% of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation or cystic fibrosis patients who don't have therapy. Supporting things like the RARE Project, and for those of you who don't know the RARE Project, I'd certainly encourage you to look it up on their website, but they're a 3-pronged strategy for disease. One is funding in their lifetime, kind of in quotes now, awareness and education, as well as community building and empowerment. The other thing is really working with industry. I mean, Pfizer, from a research point of view, we certainly want to do a lot of internal research, but we know that much of the great research is also coming from outside of Pfizer. And 3 mutually beneficial deals. We certainly don't acquire companies or license companies that don't want to be acquired or don't want to be entered into partnership. One is for an individual company called Glycomimetics. Their lead asset was for sickle cell disease, acute crisis associated with sickle cell disease. And despite understanding the genetic basis for this disease since the 1950s, no drug therapy that impacts directly to the disease outside of adjunctive care for pain has been developed for acute crisis with sickle cell. There's a phase 2 asset we licensed from Glycomimetics. Our bringing that asset in also gave that organization additional funds to continue the many drugs they have in their pipeline that are earlier for other rare diseases. So it supports the the sickle cell community in terms of our developing that drug, as well as glycomimetics and their ability to continue to develop other drugs for other diseases. Zaccaron Pharmaceuticals, a very early collaboration in various lysosomal storage disorders, 3 of them which are MPSs. We acquired a company at the end of, time's getting away from me, I guess it was 2010, about 15 months ago, called FoldRx, and their lead compound for transthyretin familial amyloid polyneuropathy. A very rare disease, about 8,000 to 10,000 people globally. Since we've acquired it, the product's been approved in Europe. It's in registration in the US. We've started phase 3 trials in Japan, and Pfizer is in about 100 countries globally, medical and commercial personnel. The ability for us to, when hopefully that product gets approved in all of these markets, the ability for us to create the awareness, the education, the diagnostics, and get this drug to as many people as we can globally certainly speaks to a role we can play as part of the old rare disease community. And also in working together closely with advocacy and policymakers. In the recent testimony before the House and Energy Subcommittee on Health, our business unit leader, Gino Germano, was part of the group that testified before that group on PDUFA 5 and many of the comments relative to rare disease. So certainly part of the ability to help be a voice in creating a policy position. So, each of these examples I think really shows our approach of being outward, of being part of the community, of being a small part of something much larger than us or any one of us in terms of helping create therapies for these rare diseases. Our number one focus is innovation to improve world health. It's a vocation we have, improving world health and using innovation to do that. I think the desire that we all have is that maybe 100 years from now, someone's given an example of how we all disrupted the trend and changed how the course of how rare diseases and therapies were approved. So then perhaps in 100 years from now, patients don't need to hear you've been diagnosed with the following rare disease and I'm sorry, there's no approved treatment. I think we can all change that. Thanks.